HOA Karen called cops on black man returning to his mansion. She's been living there for 2 weeks. Marcus had been away for almost a month. His work as a global entrepreneur often demanded travel, and this time he had been in Europe, attending meetings and closing deals. The flights had been long, the days had been packed with schedules, and the hotel rooms had felt empty despite their luxury. More than anything, Marcus longed for the peace of his own home. He often thought of his mansion, the quiet neighborhood where the trees lined both sides of the street, and the warmth of stepping into his own living room. After weeks of handshakes and presentations, the thought of returning home felt like a gift he had earned. As his black luxury car rolled into the gates of the private community, Marcus felt a wave of relief. The security guard at the entrance recognized him and waved with a smile. Marcus returned the smile, happy to be back in familiar surroundings. The community was calm, the lawns well trimmed, and the air felt fresher than the busy cities he had just left behind. He slowed down the car, admiring the quiet elegance of the houses around him. Most of the neighbors had lived there for years, and Marcus had invested a great deal of effort into making his mansion one of the finest properties. But something didn't feel right as soon as he reached his own street. He squinted at his house from a distance. The front lights were glowing even though it was daytime, the curtains on the windows were pulled in a way he didn't recognize, and there was a silver sedan parked outside his garage. He frowned. He didn't own that car. For a moment, he wondered if maybe a friend had borrowed the driveway or if his housekeeper had invited someone over. Still, the uneasy feeling in his stomach grew stronger with each passing second. Marcus parked his car by the curb and stepped out. He reached into his pocket for his house keys, gripping them firmly as he walked toward the front door. The mansion looked the same as always, tall, graceful, and full of pride, but those small details kept bothering him. Before he could place the key into the lock, a sharp voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me. What do you think you're doing?" Marcus turned and saw a woman marching toward him. She was dressed neatly, her hair cut short, and she carried herself with an air of authority. He knew who she was immediately: the president of the Homeowners Association. People in the neighborhood often referred to her as Karen because of her strict and entitled behavior. She was known for writing letters about people's lawns, complaining about parked cars, and knocking on doors to enforce rules no one else cared about. Marcus greeted her politely. "Good afternoon. I'm just getting back home." Her eyes narrowed, scanning him from head to toe. "Back home? This is private property. You don't live here. Whose house is this?" Marcus paused, trying to stay calm. "This is my house. I've lived here for years. My name is Marcus Williams." Karen folded her arms, her voice full of suspicion. "That's not possible. I know who lives in this house, and it's not you. You must be trying to break in. This neighborhood doesn't tolerate strangers wandering around." Marcus raised his eyebrows in disbelief. "Ma'am, I assure you, this is my property. I have the deed, the documents, everything you need to see. I even have the keys right here." He held them up to show her, but she didn't budge. Instead, her face grew tighter with anger. "I don't need to see anything. You people always come around thinking you can take advantage. Not in my neighborhood." She pulled out her phone, dialing quickly. "I'm calling the police. You'd better not move." Marcus sighed. He had dealt with prejudice before, but he hadn't expected it to follow him right to his own doorstep. He didn't argue. Instead, he leaned against his car, waiting. He knew the truth would come out, but the sting of being accused of trespassing on his own property cut deep. Minutes later, the sound of sirens echoed down the street. A police car pulled up, lights flashing, and 2 officers stepped out. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, curious about the commotion. Karen hurried to the officers, waving her arms dramatically. "That man is trying to break into this mansion. He doesn't belong here. Arrest him before he causes trouble. The officers approached Marcus cautiously. "Sir, can we see some identification?" one of them asked. Marcus nodded calmly. He handed over his driver's license, his business card, and then showed them his keys. "This is my house," he explained. "I just got back from a business trip. I've lived here for years. Check the records if you need to." The officers examined the ID, compared the address, and then looked at Karen. "Ma'am, his ID matches the address. He has keys. It looks like he's telling the truth." Karen's face turned red. "That can't be right. I've been here every day. This house has been empty for weeks. If it was his, I would know." Marcus tilted his head, confused. "Empty? What do you mean?" "I left on a trip, yes, but it's still my house." "Why would you think it wasn't?" The officers exchanged glances. One of them asked, "Sir, would you like us to do a quick check inside, just to make sure everything is fine?" Marcus agreed. "Yes, please. I'd like to know why she thinks the house hasn't been empty." As the officers moved toward the door with Marcus, Karen stood stiffly, biting her lip. Her confidence seemed to falter for the first time. The neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalks began whispering to one another, their eyes bouncing between Marcus and Karen. The air was thick with tension. Marcus placed the key into the lock and turned it slowly. The door swung open, and what they saw inside made everyone stop in their tracks. The house didn't look empty at all. Instead, it looked lived in. Shoes were scattered by the entrance, half-empty mugs sat on the kitchen counter, and the faint smell of cooked food lingered in the air. Marcus froze, his heart pounding. Someone had been inside his mansion while he was away. The officers glanced back at him, puzzled. "Sir, were you expecting anyone to stay here while you were gone?" Marcus shook his head. "No. Absolutely not. This is supposed to be empty. I left it locked." He stepped further inside, his eyes scanning the familiar yet disturbingly altered space. The curtains had been moved, new blankets were tossed on the couch, and there were grocery bags in the kitchen. Everything about it felt wrong. His home had been invaded. Behind him, Karen's voice cracked, full of fake confidence. Well, maybe it's not as it looks. I was just trying to make sure the place was safe. That's why I called." But Marcus could see the guilt written across her face. And deep down, he already knew the truth. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something far worse was going on. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding harder with every passing second. The house he had left locked and untouched was clearly lived in. It wasn't just a few small things out of place. It looked as if someone had made himself or herself at home. The officers behind him exchanged uneasy looks as their eyes swept across the scene. One of them walked further inside, taking notes, while the other remained at the door, watching Marcus's reaction carefully. The kitchen counter held an open cereal box, and a coffee mug with lipstick marks sat beside it. Groceries, not the kind Marcus usually bought, filled the fridge. A pair of shoes sat casually under the dining table. His chest tightened. This wasn't the homecoming he had imagined during his trip, it was a nightmare unfolding before his eyes. Karen, standing outside with her arms crossed, raised her chin as though nothing unusual had happened. "See? I told you something was going on. Clearly, this house wasn't abandoned. Someone's been here. Maybe he's lying to you, officers. Maybe he isn't the owner after all." Marcus turned, anger flashing in his eyes, but he held himself back. He knew losing his composure would only make things worse. Instead, he pulled out his phone and opened an app connected to his home security system. He had left cameras on when he traveled, but the feed had mysteriously gone offline 2 weeks ago. At the time, he thought it was a technical glitch. Now he knew better. One of the officers asked politely, "Mr. Williams, do you want to walk us through the rest of the house? We need to confirm if there's any sign of forced entry." Marcus nodded silently and led them down the hall. The living room had extra blankets on the couch, the kind Marcus never used. Upstairs, his guest room bed was neatly made but with sheets he didn't own. In his master bedroom, drawers had been opened and clothes were missing. He clenched his jaw as he realized someone had been wearing his things, walking through his private life as if it belonged to them. The officer scribbled notes. "There's no damage on the locks, no windows broken. Whoever stayed here had keys or managed to slip in without force." Marcus turned toward Karen, suspicion growing stronger. Her smug expression had faded slightly, but she still tried to keep up her act. "Maybe squatters," she suggested quickly. "This neighborhood is full of those stories. I was only trying to protect the place. That's why I called." But her tone wasn't convincing anymore. Marcus faced the officers. "I want you to check the car outside. That's not mine. Whoever has been staying here probably owns it." One officer stepped out to run the plates, leaving Marcus and the other officer inside. As Marcus stood in his own home, violated and unsettled, neighbors slowly gathered near the driveway. Whispers filled the air. They had watched the flashing lights and were curious about the scene. Some recognized Marcus and knew he was the rightful owner, while others looked uncertain, unsure whom to believe. The officer who checked the car returned with raised eyebrows. "The car is registered to Karen Matthews, HOA president." A wave of silence spread through the group. Marcus stared at Karen, disbelief painted across his face. "You been living in my house?" he asked, his voice low but full of restrained fury. Karen's face flushed. "It's not like that. You left it empty. I thought it wasn't being used. I didn't want it to fall into the wrong hands. I was keeping it safe." Her words tumbled out clumsily, and she avoided his eyes. The officer beside Marcus said firmly, "Ma'am, are you admitting you've been occupying this property without permission?" Karen stuttered, I was only making sure the place was fine. Someone had to. Besides, houses like these shouldn't just sit around empty. It looked abandoned." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. His hands trembled as he tried to hold back his emotions. This wasn't just disrespect, this was trespassing. Worse, she had turned the situation upside down, calling the police on him when she was the one guilty. The neighbors who had gathered shook their heads in shock, murmuring among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene as if they couldn't believe it was real. The officer pulled out his radio and requested backup. "We have an unlawful occupation case," he reported. "Requesting immediate assistance." Karen's confidence began to crumble. She paced nervously, throwing excuses into the air. "I was doing the right thing. I was protecting the neighborhood. He should be grateful I was watching his property. If I hadn't, who knows what could have happened." But no one was convinced anymore. Her words only revealed the entitlement in her thinking. Marcus stepped outside and faced the group of neighbors, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "You all know me. You know I've lived here for years. I've worked hard for this house, and while I was away, someone decided they had the right to live in it and then called the police on me when I returned." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors spoke up, "We know this is your house, Marcus. We've seen you here for years." Others glared at Karen, disgusted by her actions. When more officers arrived, they questioned Marcus further, collected his proof of ownership, and confirmed everything matched. They photographed the inside of the house, documenting evidence of unlawful living. Karen tried to resist, raising her voice, but the reality was clear. The car outside, the belongings inside, and her own admission had sealed her fate. As the sun began to set, Marcus sat quietly on his front steps while officers escorted Karen away for questioning. He watched her protest weakly, her authority as HOA president crumbling in front of everyone. The neighbors dispersed slowly, still shaken by the spectacle. Marcus stared at his mansion, still unable to fully process the violation. It wasn't just about his house, it was about the principle, the audacity, the prejudice that had fueled the entire confrontation. He knew this was only the beginning of a long road ahead, both legally and emotionally. But deep inside, one thing was clear: the truth had come out, and nothing would ever be the same in that neighborhood again. Marcus sat silently on the edge of his front steps, his hands clasped together, trying to calm the storm inside him. The blue and red lights of the police car still flashed across the driveway, washing the neighborhood in uneasy colors. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes still peeking through curtains and blinds. His neighbors had witnessed everything. What had started as an accusation against him had turned into a shocking revelation that left everyone speechless. The officer returned with his notebook. "Mr. Williams, we'll need a full statement from you. We'll also need to document everything inside the house. It's clear someone has been living here without permission. You're the victim in this situation." Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing. The belongings inside his mansion weren't just random items, they carried a message. Karen hadn't simply stepped inside out of curiosity. She had been living there as if it were her own. The thought made his stomach twist. Karen, now standing with her arms restrained, shouted desperately at the officers. "You don't understand. He wasn't here. I thought the house was abandoned. I was just making use of it." She looked at the crowd, hoping for support, but the neighbors only shook their heads. The truth had been laid bare, and no excuse could cover it. Marcus walked back into the living room, his steps heavy. The officers followed him, recording the scene with their body cameras. The couch cushions had been rearranged, the television remote placed neatly on the table as if someone had been watching late-night shows, and the kitchen smelled faintly of cooked pasta. It was disturbing. Every detail screamed invasion. This wasn't just a few hours of trespassing, it was weeks of someone else treating his sanctuary as their playground. He turned to the officer. "Do you realize what this means? She not only lived here but then had the audacity to call the police on me, as if I were the intruder." The officer gave a sympathetic nod. "It's not uncommon for people to justify wrongdoing when they're caught. But yes, this is serious. She crossed a line, and the law will handle it." Karen, still outside, raised her voice once more. "You people don't get it? I was protecting the community. I was making sure strangers didn't come in. Look at him. Do you really think he belongs in this kind of house?" The crowd gasped at her words. It wasn't just entitlement anymore, it was prejudice laid bare. Marcus felt a familiar pain pierce through his chest. He had worked for decades to build his career, to rise from nothing, and to create a life he could be proud of. Yet, in his own neighborhood, in his own mansion, someone still looked at him and thought he didn't belong. A neighbor stepped forward, her voice firm. "Enough, Karen. We've known Marcus for years. He's one of the kindest people in this community. You've gone too far." Others chimed in, some apologizing to Marcus, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The truth had shifted the mood completely. Karen wasn't the hero she pretended to be, she was the trespasser, the one who had abused her power as HOA president. The police prepared to escort her away for questioning, but before they left, Marcus asked to speak. He faced the group of neighbors, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. "I left my home for a short time to do my work. When I came back, I expected peace. Instead, I was accused, humiliated, and treated like a criminal on my own property. And the person who did it wasn't a stranger from outside, it was someone who was supposed to look after this community." Silence hung in the air. Marcus could see regret in some of the neighbors' faces. Others looked ashamed for ever trusting Karen's leadership. As Karen was led to the police car, she shouted one last attempt to justify herself. "This isn't fair. I was doing what was right for everyone. You'll regret this." But her words carried no power anymore. The neighbors had seen the truth. When the cars drove away, Marcus stepped back inside his mansion. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him. He touched the walls gently, as though reassuring himself that this place still belonged to him. But the feeling of safety had been cracked. The house he loved now carried the memory of intrusion and betrayal. He sat on the couch, the very couch Karen had probably used every night, and closed his eyes. He thought about his journey, the sacrifices he had made, and the battles he had fought to reach this point in life. And now, he was facing another one. This wasn't just about reclaiming his home. This was about reclaiming his dignity in the eyes of a community that had watched everything unfold. Karen's actions had revealed not just her own prejudice but the hidden doubts that still existed among some of the residents. Marcus knew this story wasn't over. The police would handle the legal side, but he had a responsibility to himself to stand firm. He wouldn't let this violation define him. Instead, he would turn it into a moment of truth for himself, for his neighbors, and for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong where they had worked hard to be. The mansion stood tall as the night settled, its lights glowing against the dark sky. But inside, Marcus sat deep in thought, realizing this was more than a homecoming. It was the beginning of a battle he hadn't expected to fight, not for his house, but for respect, justice, and the right to live without being questioned in his own space. And as he sat there, the whispers of the neighborhood faded away. The silence that remained was not empty, it was the sound of a community realizing the truth, and the first step toward change. Marcus hardly slept that night. Though Karen had been taken away for questioning, the violation of his home still echoed in every corner of the mansion. The couch felt different, the air carried a smell that didn't belong, and even the walls seemed to remind him of what had happened. But Marcus wasn't the type of man to sit back in silence. He had worked too hard and endured too much in life to let this incident pass without accountability. By morning, he already had a plan. The first step was contacting his lawyer. Marcus explained everything in detail, from the moment Karen accused him on his own driveway to the shocking discovery that she had been living inside his house. His lawyer listened carefully, pausing only to ask questions. When Marcus finished, the lawyer said firmly, "This isn't just trespassing. This is unlawful occupation, harassment, and defamation. We'll make sure she faces the consequences." Hearing those words gave Marcus strength. He knew he wasn't overreacting. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be brushed aside. It was a crime. And more importantly, it was a crime wrapped in prejudice and entitlement. Later that afternoon, police officers returned to his house to finish their investigation. They collected photographs, interviewed Marcus once more, and documented every sign of unlawful living. Karen's belongings, her clothes, her grocery bags, her personal items were packed as evidence. Seeing her things carried out of his mansion was both relieving and painful. It confirmed the invasion, but it also made his home feel violated in a way that would take time to heal. News of the incident spread quickly. A neighbor had recorded part of the confrontation, including Karen's harsh words and her shocking admission. The video traveled across social media, and within hours, Marcus's story was being shared far beyond the gates of his community. Messages of support poured in from people who had never met him but who were outraged by what he had endured. Inside the community, the reaction was immediate. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Karen had long been a controversial leader. Many residents found her rules unnecessary and her behavior overbearing. But this scandal pushed things too far. Sitting in a crowded community hall, neighbors whispered about what had happened. Some admitted they had ignored her bullying ways for too long. Others expressed shame that such prejudice had existed right under their noses. When Marcus arrived at the meeting, the room fell silent. He stood before the crowd, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I didn't want this," he began. "I came home expecting peace. Instead, I was accused of being a criminal at my own door. And worse, I discovered the person accusing me had been living inside my home. This is not just about me, it's about the values of this community. Do we allow this kind of behavior to represent us?" Heads nodded around the room. Even those who had once defended Karen couldn't argue with the truth. Her own words and actions had betrayed her. The board voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. The announcement was met with applause. Some neighbors approached Marcus afterward, apologizing and offering their support. One elderly woman, her voice trembling, said, "I'm so sorry you went through this. You deserve better. We all do." Meanwhile, Karen faced a different reality. The police confirmed charges of unlawful occupation and harassment, and there was talk of additional civil penalties. For years, she had enjoyed power in the neighborhood, controlling people with her rules and threats of fines. Now, she found herself stripped of authority, her reputation in ruins, and her future uncertain. Marcus, though relieved by the community's response, still carried the weight of the ordeal. Walking through his mansion, he could still feel the shadow of what had happened. He decided to take practical steps to reclaim his home. He hired a cleaning crew to scrub every corner, changed the locks, and updated his security system with better cameras and alarms. Slowly, the mansion began to feel like his again, though the memory of intrusion lingered. One evening, as he stood on his balcony overlooking the quiet street, Marcus reflected on everything. He thought about his journey from humble beginnings to becoming a respected businessman. He had built his success with resilience, discipline, and vision. Yet even with all his achievements, prejudice had found a way to knock on his door. But instead of breaking him, it had revealed his strength. He promised himself that he would not let the incident be remembered only as a story of violation. Instead, it would be remembered as a story of justice, of a man who stood firm, a community that chose accountability, and a reminder that dignity must be defended no matter what. As the days passed, the mansion regained its peace. The lights glowed warmly once again, the halls echoed with his footsteps alone, and the home returned to what it had always been, a place of pride and sanctuary. But outside those walls, the ripple effect of Karen's downfall continued to spread, serving as a warning to anyone who thought entitlement could override truth. For Marcus, this chapter was painful, but it also strengthened his belief in himself and in the power of justice. He knew the road ahead wasn't just about repairing his home, it was about shaping the kind of community he wanted to live in. And as he looked around at the neighbors who now greeted him with genuine respect, he realized change had already begun. Marcus's life slowly began to settle back into routine after the chaos, but the shadow of what had happened never truly left. The mansion once again felt like his own. The new locks clicked firmly into place, the polished floors gleamed, and the faint smell of lavender from the deep cleaning made the air lighter. Yet behind every restored detail lay a memory of the invasion, and Marcus knew that such scars took more than fresh paint or new curtains to fade. The legal process moved forward quickly. Karen faced multiple charges: trespassing, unlawful occupation, and harassment. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had only been protecting the property, but the evidence told another story. The car parked in the driveway, the belongings inside the house, and her very words captured on a neighbor's phone video painted a clear picture. The judge listened carefully before ruling that her actions were deliberate and unjustifiable. For Marcus, the trial wasn't just about punishment. It was about truth being recognized. When the judge stated firmly that Karen had no right to enter his home, let alone live there, Marcus felt a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't complete healing, but it was justice. Karen was ordered to pay damages, stripped of any authority in the HOA, and faced community service. She walked out of court with her head down, a stark contrast to the woman who once strutted around the neighborhood demanding respect. The story spread beyond the courtroom. News outlets reported it as a cautionary tale of entitlement and prejudice, and Marcus found himself invited to speak about his experience. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't someone who sought the spotlight. But as he thought about it, he realized sharing his story wasn't just for him. It was for others who had faced silent battles of being questioned, doubted, or excluded in places they had every right to be. At a local community forum, Marcus stood before an audience of strangers and neighbors alike. His words were simple, but they carried weight. This wasn't just about a house, he said. It was about dignity. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home, no matter who they are. What happened to me should not happen to anyone else. The room erupted in applause, not because of theatrics, but because truth spoken with honesty always touched hearts. Meanwhile, within the neighborhood, change began to take shape. The HOA, shaken by the scandal, rewrote its rules. They introduced diversity and sensitivity training for board members, ensuring no one in leadership would ever use power in such a harmful way again. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke up, promising to be more vigilant against injustice, even in small forms. For Marcus, the mansion became more than a symbol of success. It became a symbol of resilience. Each morning, when he stood on his balcony sipping coffee, he no longer thought only of the violation but also of the strength that had carried him through. His home wasn't just brick and stone, it was a testimony that hard work and integrity could withstand even the storms of prejudice. Karen, on the other hand, moved out quietly. The once bold and commanding figure was now remembered only as a warning. Her name was no longer spoken with respect or fear but with a shake of the head, a reminder of how entitlement could lead to downfall. In the quiet of his living room, Marcus sometimes replayed the journey in his mind, the shock of seeing his house lived in by someone else, the sting of being accused in front of his neighbors, the relief when justice finally stood on his side. And in those reflections, he realized something important. Life often tested him not in boardrooms or business deals, but in moments where his dignity was questioned. Each time, the choice was the same: to stay silent or to stand firm. He had chosen to stand firm. The story of what happened didn't just end with Karen's punishment. It lived on as a lesson. Neighbors told it to new families moving in, not as gossip, but as a reminder of the importance of respect. Local schools even used it as a discussion topic about fairness and community values. Marcus never wanted the spotlight, but fate had placed him in it. And in his heart, he was grateful. Because through the pain, a message had been carried further than he could have ever imagined, a message of resilience, justice, and the importance of treating every human being with dignity. As the seasons changed, the mansion stood proudly on the corner of the quiet street. Its tall windows reflected the morning sun, its garden bloomed with fresh flowers, and its owner walked confidently through the halls once again. The house was whole. Marcus was whole. And the community, though scarred, had learned to see more clearly. What began as an accusation and humiliation had ended in transformation. Marcus had reclaimed not only his home but also his peace of mind. And as he looked out over his property each evening, he smiled quietly, knowing that the story that once brought him pain had now become a beacon of hope, a reminder that truth and justice could always prevail.